No, totally. And I mean, Harari definitely is. He uses it as like the same negative connotation that racism is. So he's basically like and this he was specifically talking about empire when he brought this up, and it was just the fact that there's a lot of the time
saying a culture's inferior and thus we have the right to dominate.
Exactly. And that's that's so on point.
Well, I mean, you can tear apart that analysis just by looking at, what's the number one existential crisis we face right now on this planet, besides the nuclear war, of course, which has been there since we made them, is climate change. And so the culture that we use that argument to destroy completely the Native Americans had the cultural lessons in place that right now would be saving us.
Yeah.
So there goes that argument.
Totally. No, totally.
Yeah, and I think like 7 generations into the future, right? Isn't that their whole mentality?
I mean, I'm sure it varies a lot tribe to tribe, but that's.
I mean, that would
there's
be
a constant theme of prioritizing future generations and borrowing this planet from your children and all that stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, it just makes a little more sense because they thought of it in much more like cyclical nature, and like if we're taking out more than the cycle can replenish, then eventually. Like the math doesn't add up. It seems like that'd be kind of an easy thing to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thinking of things in terms of cycles is certainly much more based in reality than how we do it in the West, which is a linear progression.
Well, and I think one of the things that I get annoyed with, and I'm sure you do too, with like the whole idea of like studying like different religions and mythologies and stuff like that and how they work and like the lessons that they teach, is like, and I'm sure Sam Harris would get annoyed at this too, is like, if we actually take into consideration the like biological and just like the functioning of the biosphere, those are all cycles. We call them that. We say this is the nitrogen cycle.
Yeah.
This is the water cycle.
All cycles.
Yeah, it's like,
life and death.
Exactly.
And we're literally trying to, with technology, change that though.
That's true.
To create.
Well, but you can't. The idea would be you don't change the.
We're trying to create permanency.
But you don't get. But the cycles replenish the permanency.
Right.
The processes are what create the length of time that we're able to be alive anyway.
Yeah, I mean, even if you get to the farthest extension of that, conversation, I mean, eventually the universe is going to end.
Right. That's what I was going to bring up. Is that if we look at it from a biological aspect, everything is cyclical for the most part. Although you can look at a lot of you could look at evolution maybe as like a linear type thing, but I would say that. If you look at things from the standpoint of physics, everything is much more linear. Right. It just goes, and energy is becoming, or things are becoming less and less ordered. So chaos is prevailing, and eventually, the overall energy of the universe is getting more and more spread out and less usable, and eventually that will just.
Well, but that's only linear if it doesn't repeat.
That's true, but we have no basis for
True. But
thinking that
the whole realm before the universe and after it is a blind spot. So we can't
we have no idea
define anything based off of either being linear or cyclical.
One of the ideas that has also been brought up philosophically is that we as humans think linearly because what we do is we make projections and then that creates linear time. But with physics, it's not. Those are predictions, right? And you're using constants, which are atemporal. They don't have time associated with them. They will be, this is a constant that happens no matter what. And then you place that in this kind of projection where you would then say, okay, well, we're right here. Now let me create time. And then say this far in the future, I'm going to create a projection where if all of these things stayed atemporal, they didn't change, that's what's going to happen. So the idea is that physics is atemporal, biology is cyclical, and then we can create that we create the linear in our brains. It's not actually real in the moment, I guess, would be in the actual system that we're dealing with.
I mean, that's a good point because we are filtering everything through our own ideas, of course. And I would say, human lifespan is something that seems very linear right now.
Totally.
Right? We don't Benjamin Button at any time in our life, right? And so a lot of particles in physics don't necessarily obey our conventional ideas of time. Like sometimes they will travel backwards in time from what we know. That's how we conceive of them at least. And so I suppose it may be more of a remedial idea to think that it is linear, and perhaps if we were to, increase our understanding of physics, maybe a lot of it is more cyclical than we understand, or seems more like less constrained by time. But at least from our perspective, it does certainly seem like time is moving one direction, and we have no access.
Oh, real. Okay,
the
so I'm
other
not
direction.
saying like so for the individual. I would never say that for the individual, time wouldn't appear linear for sure.
Yeah.
Like, because that's like how
Well,
we.
but isn't it non-linear from like the fourth dimension or something like that? Like I don't know much about this shit. But there's that whole idea that like we're trapped in linear time.
Yeah.
But that's just one. Like if you go up to another
One more
dimension, all of
It would be
time
fixed,
exists
but-
simultaneously or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well.
mean, that's all theoretical, of course.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's not like no one's been there.
Yeah.
But like
Unless you took enough LSD.
for me, it's also just like actual like. Linear time is good for projections and good for future. It's basically future telling. You're trying to do like premonitions of what will happen. So, and science has been argued to be the best like tool for that. That's what but the idea would also to be don't get confused and think that that's like real, because what you're doing is imagining something.
Sure.
And you may be, even if you are accurate, it doesn't like. The idea would be is like it's only useful when you're trying to solve when you're trying to project into the future, but if you allow that to like permeate through all of your thinking, that's when you start getting screwed up.
Right.
Because the idea would be the moment that those constants start to change, that you made this cool projection about I'm the emperor of the earth and this is what I need for that to happen. Then the moment one of those constants starts to change, then you attack it again.
That's that whole idea Alan Watts talks about, right? Where we mistake our systems for reality, our constructs of thinking for reality.
Sure.
I mean, like time,
Yep. Well, I do think. Sorry to cut you off. I was just gonna say I think it's really hard for humans to get out of the mode of thinking linearly because our experience is so linear.
Totally, but that's where, for me, I argue that's why, I've even brought up Sean and I, thinking about different mythologies and different and science. Yeah,
having a mythology that gives you a view of the overarching nature of reality, which can be a corrective to your subjective experience.
Well, exactly. It's the corrective, right? It's the corrective to the subjective of you are trying to accomplish something, and for some reason you haven't thought about the rest of humanity. It's just it's self-centered. If you think of if you only think linearly, you're thinking self-centeredly.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think again of Native American thinking, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was just. I mean, yeah. How do you not think that way?
Yeah.
Because we're so tied to it.
Well, but that's a good question to ask, and I think people have been asking that for a long time. And you do that by having conversations with everyone else, because everyone else's linearity is different.
Well, but it's also so part and parcel of the system we exist in. When you think of, American civilization, for example. I mean, you're thinking linearly because you have this idea of self that you're trying to improve over time.
Right.
By gaining skills or gaining knowledge or gaining resources or gaining status, and it's very self-centered. It's very accumulation to the self over time. Whereas from what I know, a more Native American way of viewing things is to ground the self in nature and in the oneness of things and in the cycles of the natural world. And I think that balances out that human ego. And I think maybe the human ego was much healthier when it evolved because it existed within the context of that way of viewing things, of a nature-based reality.
Totally.
And that it is really our civilization that has made us sick.
Well, do you see, for me, it's they're reciprocal, because the idea would be...
As long as they're together, we've subtracted nature and doubled down with an ego construct around the ego.
Well, exactly, but yeah, I mean the other has to be there for it to be reciprocal, right? So, but the idea would be that it's you need the foundation of understanding your part in all of it, right? You need to understand all of it to know your part in it.
Vice versa.
Totally.
It seems like we went down a different path, when we went from hunter-gatherer to civilization, when we started cooking our food, those are all forks in the road that we went down, and we went down the civilization path,
Yeah, I mean, it was really agriculture that changed everything.
But
that was the beginning.
I would never say that culture is not able to live in the world of the cycles and stuff like that. It's arrogance that makes it think that we can live outside of the cycles.
Well, this is my view too. Is that yes, that we can have a civilization that reincorporates that aspect that we've lost, but that would be seeing civilization itself as taking a cyclical view. So it's like it leaves nature, goes through this, and then comes back to nature. So, which is a way of thinking that's come about a few different times. It's in anthropology. It's in the writing of Karl Marx, actually, talking about primitive hunter-gatherer societies as kind of like primitive communism, and this idea that his whole intellectual exercise, trying to imagine an alternative to what we have now, is an idea of how do we get civilization back to the foundation of what we had when we were hunter-gatherers, that kind of like democratic, egalitarian way of living.
I mean, can we do that with also like going to Mars, traveling, like answering some of the more bigger questions that we want to answer about the universe? Because I feel like we went this path. If we stayed on the hunter-gatherer, we would have never gotten to where we are today.
See, but you're saying, do we have to keep on the line, as opposed to come full circle? But like, not full circle as in we go back to where we were, but like, do we regain what was lost, or is it just that a straight line from hunter-gatherer out into the universe?
Right. Well, I do think that's an interesting point, though, because the way that we were thinking about things, the way that Native Americans were thinking about things. I mean, you can make a lot of cases for why the Native Americans weren't as advanced as the Europeans.
And many of them were environmental, but culture.
Our
culture is certainly more conducive to innovation.
Definitely. And so you wonder if the cultures were switched geographically, would would the Europeans still have been more advanced, although not as much because they wouldn't have had the economic advantages, but would they have been more advanced still in terms of technology than the Native Americans? And obviously that's a big what if that we can't really answer, but that type of ideology that the Native Americans had didn't necessarily what's the word, incentivize that kind of development.